Welcome. Welcome, friends, to Living the Declaration, a webinar on Indigenous rights. My name is Henry Krause, and I'm one of your MCs for this evening. I'm part of Mennonite Church, British Columbia's Indigenous Relations Working Group, which is hosting this webinar. And I'm zooming in from the traditional and unceded territory of the Kwantlen First Nations. Sharing the MCing this evening is Bridget Finley, and I'd like to ask her to introduce herself.
Thanks, Henry. It's great to be with you this evening. I'm zooming in from Stolo territory here, the land of Sumas First Nation and Matsqui First Nation. And as Henry said, my name's Bridget. I am part Creek Native American, and I'm also European ancestry. I work for Mennonite Central Committee BC, and we have a partnership with Mennonite Church BC called Partners in Reconciliation. Through this partnership, I assist and support MC churches to learn about Indigenous history, culture, and current issues. And I encourage reconciliation and respectful relationship building with their local Indigenous communities and people. It's good to be with you this evening.
Thanks, Bridget. Tonight's conversation is an important one for us. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has stated that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is the framework for reconciliation across all sectors of Canadian society. The TRC called all churches to adopt and comply with the declaration, and it called all governments, federal, provincial, and territorial, to adopt and implement it. In November of 2019, last year, the provincial government of BC passed legislation recognizing the application of the declaration to its laws. And a month later, the government of Canada mandated the Minister of Justice to table federal declaration legislation by the end of this year. So how will this legislation actually impact relationships on the ground? And for church people like myself, what's our role and responsibility in all of this? So tonight we're privileged to have three amazing panelists explore this conversation with us. Allow me to introduce them to you. Romeo Saganash was born in Waswanipi, a Cree community in the Iowitski territory of northwestern Quebec. Age of 7, he was taken away to residential school in Latuque and spent the next 10 years of his life there. In the 1980s, Romeo was invited to represent the Grand Council of the Cree at the UN and spent 23 years working with colleagues for the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Between 2011 and 19, Romeo served as a member of Parliament, and in 2016, he introduced Bill C-262, an act to ensure that the laws of Canada are in harmony with the UN Declaration. That act made it through the House of Commons, but died in the Senate last year on Indigenous Peoples Day. But Romeo continues to fight for the human rights of Indigenous peoples. Chief Judy Wilson is from the Neskonlith First Nation and has served her community for 10 years as chief and 8 years as a council member. And currently she's the Secretary Treasurer of the Union of the BC Indian Chiefs. Chief Wilson is a strong advocate for Indigenous peoples' self-determination, the recognition of inherent title and rights. She's also an advocate for the fundamental shifts needed to survive for all people. These shifts include transitioning to clean energy, challenging consumer purchasing habits away from big conglomerates towards local foods and local products, and supporting and maintaining traditional food security and harvesting. And we have Jennifer Preston with us, who is from Guelph, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anasabak peoples. Jennifer coordinates the Indigenous Rights Program on behalf of the Canadian Friends Service Committee, which is a justice arm of the Quakers. For years, she's held the Indigenous Peoples Human Rights File for the International Body of Quakers at the UN. She was involved in the lobbying efforts to ensure the successful adoption of the Declaration. A member of the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples and a co-editor of Realizing the UN Declaration published by UBC Press, Jennifer focused much of her work on the Declaration's implementation. Thank you, Jennifer, Chief Wilson, and Romeo for being with us this evening. We're deeply honored, and especially those of you who are in Ontario who are even more into the evening than those of us in British Columbia. We look forward to a great conversation, a time of learning. And as we move into our conversation, I just want to remind those watching that you can ask questions and put them into the Q&A box down at the bottom in the middle. We'd love to hear from you and are planning to answer at least some of your questions during the webinar. So Romeo, if I could start with you, let's start things off by asking you, over the last 2 decades, you were involved in drafting of the Declaration. Would you briefly introduce us to your role in its drafting and what you think is the important element of that final document adopted by the UN General Assembly back in 2007?
Well, first of all, I think I need to mention that the fact that everything started in 1984 for me, when the then ambassador of the Cree to the United Nations, Ted Moses, asked me to travel with him. I bumped into him in the village, and he said, "What are you doing right now?" I said, "Nothing." So Ted asked me to travel with him to Geneva in 1994, and he explained to me that they were starting the process of drafting a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's going to be an important instrument, he said, in international human rights law. And he said that I think I would be interested in pursuing this work when he's gone. So I went. He even mentioned in 1984 that I didn't have to do anything, just observe and see how it's done, and perhaps you'll be good at this after. And that's what I did in 1984. And I've gone back every summer for the 10 days of the working group that worked on the drafting of this declaration, every summer for the 23 years after that, to 2007, when the declaration was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So for 23 years, every summer, I went to Geneva, sometimes with Ted Moses, sometimes with others. But the Indigenous participation in this process was instrumental. Our participation was very important. Our input into the drafting was highly critical, I believe. And we tried to address, one of the strategies, at least the Grand Council of the Cree had, was to try to address every situation in the articles of the Declaration. So I think we managed to achieve that. And I think it's important to remember that the critical provisions of the UN Declaration, of course, Article 3, which addresses the right of self-determination of Indigenous peoples. The word peoples was important because we started off with the word populations, Indigenous populations, from the outset, and we disagreed with that. So the nation states proposed Indigenous people instead, which is still not acceptable because the right of self-determination belongs to peoples under international law. So, and that's the word we wanted, and that's the S that was important during these discussions. Of course, our relationship to our lands, territories, and resources was the other big challenge during these negotiations. And I think the provisions that address those aspects are critical as well, of course. And one of the provisions that we rarely quote in discussing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is Article 1, whereby it states that Indigenous peoples have the same rights as other peoples and people around the world, and the international human rights law applies to Indigenous peoples as well. So Article 1 is important in this discussion, and I find it important to mention that because we seem to forget that Indigenous peoples throughout the world, I'm guessing we're about 400 million today, that our rights are fundamentally human rights as well. There are different frameworks, constitutional, international law, legal frameworks that exist today, whether it's our treaties, whether it's our constitution, whether it's case law addressing indigenous constitutional rights in this country, whether it's indigenous law, period. These are different legal frameworks that exist. They're distinct, but they are also mutually reinforcing. And that's important to remember. But I want to get back to this important aspect of indigenous rights as being human rights as well. There are constitutional rights, for sure, that we know. There's Section 35 of our Constitution that reminds us of that. And but I think the fact that we've never addressed in this country, the courts or anybody else, our rights as human rights, is concerning for me. In the Chilcotin case, I think the Supreme Court talks about the Charter in Part 1 of our Constitution, and the Section 35 rights, which is in Part 2 of our Constitution. Well, the Supreme Court defines them as sister provisions that serve to limit the powers of governments, both provincial and federal. I think that's important to remember. So we're getting close to that as well. And when you do not address indigenous rights as human rights as well, I think it gets a free pass for conservatives particularly, that will never accept the United Nations Declaration, that I'm pretty certain about. And it allowed the 5 unelected, unaccountable senators to defeat my bill in the Senate in June of last year, practically 1 week after my mom passed away. Anyway, so I think it's important to remember those aspects of our discussion. One of the other aspects that we'll talk about implementation of these rights, but Bill C-262, I would like to remind people, simply attempted to confirm that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples applies in Canadian law, like all the other international conventions that we signed on to, like all other treaties that we sign on to. That's what Bill C-262 attempted to do. It was defeated, but I still claim that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples applies in Canadian law. We have to remember that. One last thing before I finalize my 10 minutes here is that the government attempted in the previous parliament before I left to push forward a rights recognition framework. And I heard Justin Trudeau in the House talk about this for 24 minutes. And he wasn't quite clear if it was going to be a policy or a legislation that he would introduce for this rights recognition framework that he called. Well, our rights are already recognized by the courts, by the Constitution, by international law. So why do we need a rights recognition framework when our rights are already recognized? I think the objective should be to respect our rights. And since the UN Declaration applies in Canadian law, I think it's a matter of respecting those provisions when it comes to issues that we are confronted with in this country, and it's a matter of implementing those rights in this country. So I think that's as opening remarks. That's what I wanted to say, but I also take this final 30 seconds of my first 10 minutes to say I'm very grateful and honored to be on this panel with two people that I admire a lot, Jennifer and Judy. They've done a lot of work to get to where we are today. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Romeo. Appreciated the context, the historical context, and your good work over the many years. Chief Judy Wilson, British Columbia has adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through legislation, as we know. What role did the Union of BC Indian Chiefs play in its adoption, and how will the Union be involved in the implementation phase?
I just wanted to start off by saying, building off on what Romeo has said, and I think it's so important, the context that he explained. And I wanted to say in 1948, when the Universal Human Rights Declaration was made, our people, our Indigenous people around the world were not thought of. They were not included in those universal human rights. So that's the reason why our Indigenous people and globally had to come together to develop the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People so that we would have a framework for Indigenous rights. And the Human Rights Council under the UN did take it and make changes to it. And there are books that show all the different changes they made, but some of the changes that didn't take place were the self-determination, that clause stayed the same, and some of the language and free prior informed consent. So those are very strong articles and clauses in the UN Declaration. And the other, I think the other part is the land, territory, and resources that Romeo mentioned as well. Those are really key, especially in some of the provinces like British Columbia, where we have the Crown claiming that they own 80–90% of our territories. So I think that's the other, just a bit more context before we start in on the role of the Union. The Union historically has had a pivotal role internationally, namely through some of the chiefs, the founding chiefs, one of them being the late Grand Chief George Manuel. For many years worked internationally and nationally, and also his sons, Arthur, Manuel, and Bobby, who are also chiefs. And they did a lot of work and supporting and there when a lot of the drafting happened in regards to the UN Declaration. And you know, it is what it is now. It was stronger language when it was initiated, and you know, the Human Rights Council and the UN, and to make it more palatable, if you will, for the state governments. So it is what it is now. But I think Romeo hit it right on the head about, you know, it's going to be challenges on implementing it and then upholding those standards, those principles that we all ought to for a higher level human rights framework. The Union BC Indian Chiefs, so we advocated for the implementation of the UN Declaration into provincial and federal legislation since the inception and when Canada endorsed it. And from that, the provincial level, the UBCIC was intimately involved in the planning, the drafting, and engagement process for the Declaration Act we have in BC now. In implementing the UN Declaration into provincial legislation framework was part of what was called the concrete action plan, because we had a document that started with the Liberals, and then when the NDP came in, the commitment document, that's what it was called, how we would engage our provincial government. Then the chiefs worked, and then we outlined the action plan around the commitment document. So we set a table basically and a framework on how we would engage with whatever party was in. It was the Liberals, then it was the NDP. The NDP had to work really hard to ensure that that was approved through cabinet. So the commitment document was approved through cabinet. And it's a broad document setting out the vision, principles, and actions for advancing a relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. Because out here in BC, we have many of our nations, including the Secwepemc Nation, who are outside of the treaty process. So a large amount of communities, First Nations, are not within the treaty process as it exists in the modern treaties today. So there's still a lot of work to do on setting out what that process would look like, and because it can't be under, you know, the existing one, because it's very narrow, and it still is, you know, leads to a lot of the what you give up to engage with the province and the feds. So I think it's really important to understand that, the context of that. And then also the commitment document is between BC and the First Nations Leadership Council, which includes the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and was endorsed by Cabinet, as I mentioned, and by the BC First Nations through resolutions through the BCFN, the First Nations Summit, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So we were mandated by the chiefs to carry out this work, and the Joint Core Committee, or Joint Core Working Group, which includes myself and the political leads, you know, that was involved with from First Nation Summit, and also which was Cheryl Casimir, and also Regional Chief TG from the BC Assembly of First Nations. So we were actually involved in the drafting instructions and feeding the information into the drafting of the legislation. It was a really challenging process, because, as you know, typically legislation is not really built or made to include directly First Nations. So it was really challenging doing that. We had to go through like a legal team. So we had Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond for EBCIC, and it was a unprecedented process that we set out. We had the legal and policy team worked around the clock to get the legislation drafted, and we provided regular updates to the chiefs at our assemblies. And once there was a draft, we had to really push the province to allow the chiefs in BC to sign non-disclosure agreements, so that they could see what the consultation, what the draft looks like. So we did that at the different assemblies that we had. And then we worked with the province on a joint communication strategy to ensure the broad support and wide education of that legislation, because there's a lot of groups that didn't buy into it. A lot of groups were skeptical, and a lot of groups thought it meant a veto over everything. And meanwhile, veto isn't even included in the UN Declaration. So there's a lot of fear and angst over it, and even now, you know, it's just a lot of challenging in making sure all the other legislation and laws align. So there's a lot of work around that. So when the legislation was passed, the First Nation leadership was on the floor at the legislature. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, our president for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, was there. You know, for that historic moment, he was right on the floor. The rest of us witnessed it. Were in there, but October 24th, but sort of on the sidelines. But our Grand Chief was right there, and, you know, speaking directly to the assembly. And now we're working with the province on the action plan to implement DRIPA, and it'll be fed into all the First Nations and into legislation required of the DRIPA. And that's the big part of the work to me, alignment of the laws. And there was a challenge right now, even as the Bill 41 is in legislation, the province continues to not always be aligned with it. So that's a big part of the full implementation that we're working on, and it's taking a lot of effort, a lot of continued talks and continued push. And it's like all tables, we have to be very aware and monitoring and pushing back and saying, no, this is not only is it Bill 41, it's what Romeo said, it's international law, and it applies in Canadian law, so that, you know, Canada signed on to 7 covenants, and some of them are binding. And I think what the Canadian application in Canadian law has to, you know, be made so that we can have legal pluralism in Canada. So we have our, it's not just colonial based law, we have our Indigenous laws recognized, and it's legal pluralism, because the real important parts are self-determination and free, prior, informed consent as well. So I think that's a lot of the challenges that we have. That I just want to speak quickly. I don't know where my time is. I don't have a timer thing here, but Romy also talked about the rights recognition framework, and I'll explain why the government was trying to do that. They wanted their processes and their already existing framework with comprehensive claims and specific claims and the right to self-government all put together, because that's their process, and they laid it out what that process was. So they wanted that buy-in to the rights recognition framework. And I remember going to policy meetings in May 1st and 2nd over in Edmonton, and a lot of the chiefs, we had to be very vocal about the concerns over that rights recognition framework and the policy changes, and the government had to delay that. They had to rethink what they were doing. So it's very much still a concern, because there has to be the proper recognition and the proper, what Romeo talked about, the respecting of the rights, the existing rights, and the ones in Canadian law and international law, with the treaties, you know, not the historic treaties, but the international treaties, sorry, and then you know, the ones that are outside the treaty processes. So I think there's still a lot of work in those areas that have to be done. The modern treaties are already aligned with the, you know, what's happening with what the Canadian government is intending. So, you know, but the ones outside of the treaty, we have issues, and the ones that have the international treaties are still not having their sovereign rights upheld. So I think that's a real concern. So I'm not sure where my time frame is, and it's probably more I could add, but I think I'll wait till the next question, because I could probably go on with this for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. There's chance to get at some more of the questions that or issues that you want to get to. Appreciate your place here in BC, being able to speak to some of those things from your position of authority and responsibility. Jennifer, I understand that the Quakers have been real leaders in advocating for the adoption and implementation of the Declaration. Wondering, how did the Quakers come to be involved in this historic opportunity for conciliation and justice? And can you recommend a strategy for how other faith communities can advance this agenda?
Hi, yes, thank you, Henry. Thanks for the invitation to be here tonight, and it's a real pleasure to be here with my friends and colleagues, Romeo and Kukpi7 Judy Wilson. So Quakers have been involved in the Declaration really since the beginning of this work, even before the work began in the early 80s, but in the late 1970s, supporting Indigenous partners at the United Nations, and through both of the working groups that developed the Declaration, and then through the adoption by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And that includes, of course, we were working with the Grand Council of the Cree in Geneva, and now in our implementation work, we're continuing to support our partners in the UN in both Geneva and New York, and that includes the Cree as well as UBCIC and others in their work in the international forums. And CFSC is also able to support many of our Indigenous partners through the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Partly, I think this is because Quakers have been active advancing human rights at the United Nations since the time of the League of Nations, before we actually had the United Nations. But since the time after the post-World War II, when the UN opened their offices that they currently have, Quakers opened offices in Geneva and New York to play that role, to be present at the UN and to be present advancing human rights and working in solidarity with many partners. And while I work for Quakers here in Canada, Canadian Friends Service Committee, our office works in partnership with the Quaker UN offices. That's how I received the mandate to do this work internationally. So Quakers, in addition to having their long-term relationship at the UN, Quakers have historic testimonies to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And we, like many faith bodies, have long and checkered history in our relationships with Indigenous peoples. But now, of course, as part of our faith tradition, we understand justice for Indigenous peoples is intimately tied to our testimony of peace and living in a peaceful community. We all know that peace and justice are intimately linked, and they are indivisible, so we cannot have one without the other. And I would say that, you know, in this country that we are now calling Canada, I don't think it's unknown at this point that Canada really was founded on theft and fraud, and that all settlers in Canada have benefited directly or indirectly from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories. And while we can now understand this in a modern context, we have to ask ourselves, how are we addressing this profound injustice? How are we speaking to both the historical but also ongoing injustices? Quakers and Mennonites are both peace churches, but all faith traditions promote peace and justice. So if we're not active in fighting for Indigenous rights to be respected and upheld, are we honoring our commitment to peace? And living in a place of continued injustice is unacceptable. We must live our faith by acting for justice. So how do we actively decolonize? How do we in our communities ensure that Canada decolonizes? What is our role in this journey? How is this part of our faith? And how do we live our faith by engaging at a deep level with this journey? Canadian Quakers, Canadian Friends have formally committed to the implementation of the Declaration, and we actually did this before the TRC had asked all churches to do that in their calls to action, which I'd like to remind everyone is now more than 5 years ago that the TRC had their closing events and released their calls to action. And I would also let people know that the call to action to the churches to make this commitment to the UN Declaration was the only one out of the 94 calls to action that they put a deadline on. You know, they're very serious, the commissioners and their calls to the churches to engage in this work with the declaration. And so that one call to action had a deadline that they were asking faith communities to meet in their commitment to implementing the declaration. And the work that Canadian Friends have done with our engagement to the declaration and our commitment to the declaration has now actually become part of our national spiritual discipline and will be forevermore. I think that I believe, certainly, and Quakers believe, that the faithful commitment to the declaration is part of the journey in understanding the legacy of colonialism and also the need to engage with healing and with reconciliation. And we have to play an active role in dismantling colonialism. Many faith bodies, including the Mennonites, of course, were actively championing Bill C-262 that Romeo was speaking about earlier. And why? Well, because, as I say, we as people of faith, we have to be committed to peace and justice. And we have to recognize that we have been a part of the injustice, and we have to be committed to that change. We are committed to the deconstruction of power structures that have and continue to oppress Indigenous peoples. And I think that's very important. I think that is what drives the work that Quakers have done with the Declaration. And it is also a message that I obviously would share with other faith bodies, that, you know, if you're really living your faith, you have to be active in that deconstruction of power structures that oppress Indigenous peoples. And reconciliation or conciliation must include a commitment to change. It must include redress, you know, and that is part of the UN Declaration. And it's crucial now in Canada that we move from this colonial paradigm that this modern nation state was founded under and move to a new paradigm that respects Indigenous people's self-determination and other human rights. And such a paradigm is laid out for us in the UN Declaration. And so, of course, this does include the respect for Indigenous title, for Indigenous governance, and Indigenous legal orders. So when you talk about a strategy for other faith communities, I mean, I think there's many different things I could share on that, but just to touch on some of the obvious ones, you know, one, build relationships. And I would say that in the early years when I went to Geneva, that's what I spent all of my time doing. You know, bear witness, speak truth to power. You stand in solidarity. And I would say, you know, strategies for faith communities, educate yourselves on the doctrines of superiority, which includes discovery and includes terra nullius. Educate yourselves on the ongoing effects of colonialism, on residential schools and their legacies. Educate yourself on the history of the land where you live today. And I would also say, in a strategy for faith communities, and this is the Quaker in me, be quiet, you know, listen. And when you're working, you know, in our work, the reason that we have been able to build relationships over decades is also because we understand that our role in that relationship is to be standing in solidarity. And so in the work that we've done with Indigenous peoples around the Declaration, our Indigenous partners are the ones that are setting the mandate. Then they're saying, hey, this is what we need from you. This is what we want you to do. We're not saying, hey, we've got a great idea. How about we all go off on this direction? No, listen to the direction that Indigenous peoples are setting. One of the things I would suggest is a interesting thing for listening to is that CFSC currently is running a video series on reconciliation, and because we often get asked, as a mainly settler faith tradition, we often get asked, well, what does it mean? What should I do? How do I get engaged? So we did some videos with some of our partners, Indigenous partners, where we asked them questions about how should settlers engage? How do you want, what kind of things should partners do? What does it mean to be a good partner? So I would recommend those videos, and you can hear some Indigenous voices answering those types of questions. And I think you can find them if you go to CFSC's webpage. And as for the Declaration, in terms of strategies for faith communities on the Declaration, you know, as Romeo well knows, I ate and slept and breathed Bill 641 and then 262 with Romeo and many other people for years. And I think that, you know, there's a reason that we've all advocated for federal legislation, and of course also support the very, very critical work that has been done for provincial legislation in BC. This is really important to advocate for this legislation. It's really important to have a legislative framework to both, as Romeo said, it's going to affirm, I mean, it already has, the legal space already exists. The legislation is to affirm that legal space and also to lay out a path for the implementation. You know, you can't just make a commitment to something, say, oh yes, we're very committed to the UN Declaration, and what? So, you know, a legislative framework for implementation is really important. There's key elements to that were laid out in Bill C-262. There's key elements to that were laid out, that are laid out in Bill 41 in BC. And I will say that there will be, there is about to go live, it's not quite live, but it will be very useful for faith communities, a website that is specifically for resources and tools for ecumenical bodies on participating and advocating for this federal legislation. The website's going to be called faithinthedeclaration.ca. And it isn't live yet, but it is going to be, and it is going to contain a lot of information and advocacy tools for engaging. And as I say, why do we need legislation? Well, I would say, you know, I've done a lot of work and I've spoken a lot on implementing the Declaration. And the Declaration implementation is multifaceted. It has political elements, it has legal elements, it has social elements, and where the implementation happens in different places may look completely different. Indigenous peoples will make decisions about their priorities on implementation, but we need this legal commitment. And we need to have that cemented in law, and cemented in law the respect for Indigenous peoples' human rights. And it means that governments and others, including industry, have to work with Indigenous peoples, fully respecting their right of self-determination. And I think that this is really important for faith communities to engage with this, because it's decision makers need to know that this matters. They need to know that this matters to settlers. And frankly, they need to know that this matters to voters. That is important. It has to be a priority we are in a minority government situation. You know, obviously the parliament has been upended in the last several months because of the pandemic. But this government made a commitment to federal legislation in their speech from the throne, in their mandate letters. They have repeated it publicly many, many times. So it needs to be a priority. I think they need to be reminded that we all appreciated that priority being stated, and we want to see it happen. And as Romeo said, you know, Bill C-262, you know, it made it to 5 seconds before the finish line. And we can't do that again. You know, it was shameful and shocking when it happened last June. And we can't be in a situation where we have a government saying, yes, we're fully committed to this. Oh, we're calling an election. Too bad you only got so far. No, we have to get this across the finish line. And this bill must be passed in this parliament. And I think that faith communities can play an excellent role in getting engaged and educating themselves and encouraging representatives of government to make sure that this is a priority.
Hey, thank you, Jennifer, for coming from that place for us, those of us who are people of faith. And thank you to Chief Wilson and Romeo for your perspectives on where this work needs to happen. There's a question here that I'd like each of you to respond to as well, sort of a three-part. So where do you expect there to be challenges to the implementation of the declaration, in particular with respect to Indigenous title and jurisdiction? How do you think these challenges can be addressed and worked through, and what gives you hope? So where do you see the challenges coming? How do you see the challenges being addressed, and what gives you hope in this journey? I know if I could start with you, Chief Wilson, because in BC, we do have something that's already put in place. We've already had issues that come up in relation to that. So I'm just wondering what you think we should do with this.
I think first of all, I have to say it's been unprecedented in the legislation that we've been working on. I think it was like 11 or 13 different pieces of federal and provincial legislation we've been involved with, and you know, the language legislation and the child and family. So they both include the UN declaration in those legislations. And as I see moving forward, there's going to be more and more legislation that's going to be including the UN declaration. So even if the government continues to stall at what happened with the bill 262, the different pieces of legislation are going to be coming together and implementing it in a widespread legislation. And that's a slower process. We should have that framework, and it should be the full recognition, the full implementation of the UN declaration, not a piecemeal or where it's open to interpretation for domestication by Canada or interpreting it to any other standards that they place in. It should be the full standards, the full articles, the full what the UN declaration as international law and international human rights is intended for. So I think that's part of the challenges. And in BC, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's the implementation of the alignment of the laws. Some of the legislation that we're putting before the House, they're not including the Bill 41 as they should be. So it's monitoring and it's ensuring that the full UN declaration is being implemented into the different laws and legislations, and also into policies and regulations is another issue in regard to the legislation to make it effective. So I think it's going to be a broad number of legislations still coming forward, and we have to be what the precedent was already set in Bill 41, how involved we were in the drafting. It should continue on to all this, the other legislation as well. And I think, so the implementation has to be just not at the government level. It's certainly, I think I remember it being said that our Indigenous governments need to be implementing the UN declaration and all the things that we do. I know at the Union we have it included in all of our resolutions when we're doing different resolutions on different issues. We call on the UN declaration. And I want to make mention of another one that maybe Romeo or Jennifer can talk a little bit more about it in their discussion, is the Americas Declaration. Is where the UN Declaration may be weak, we hold up the Americas Declaration. So that's the other piece we have to be talking about, how do we work with them together, and how do we ensure both are as international law and mechanisms that we're using for that implementation. And the other thing I think is part of our challenge is the rights recognition framework, because it's being piecemealed and to be implemented by the federal government to keep existing processes there, which, as Jennifer mentioned, is based on the colonial doctrine of discovery and other old colonial notions, old colonial policies. So that's really what we're talking about, that this change that has to happen into, recognition of self-determination for Indigenous people, and also, the free, prior, informed consent. I think that's going to be a lot of the challenges. And how do we do that? There's innovative ways to do that. Some of the different organizations have already done the Truth and Reconciliation. They did different protocols, different calls for it to be implemented into their organizations. So in their work in engaging business with Canada or the federal government, if they have a strong human rights, a strong endorsement of the UN Declaration, I think that helps, and because it's being implemented at all levels. I've seen school districts do that. We worked with one that adopted the Truth and Reconciliation, the full calls for action, and then they did some reconciliation planning and had a ceremony over it, and the whole school, all the students participated in it. That was, and I explained to them, with feasting and doing the protocol for reconciliation is good, but it's the actual implementation of it. And I think they're finding that out, because we do steps by steps to do that, because it also addressed the racism in those institutes. It'll address, having human rights for Indigenous people in those institutions. So, it's a multi-level process, and it's good that what Jennifer's talking about, a lot of the multi-faith organizations are doing that, and as well as some of the business sector and some of these education institutes. We have a lot of work to do in those areas, and so I don't believe it's a limited, narrow process. I think we have to broaden it and widen it, and we still have to continue working internationally, because a lot of the remedies are being exhausted around, especially around a lot of major development, like the Trans Mountain or Coastal GasLink. We've had to raise those over to the United Nations, and because we don't have a full human rights framework implemented here in Canada, so we have to go over to the United Nations to ensure that human rights are being respected. And then the UN writes letters to Canada, so, instructing them, no, you have to implement the UN Declaration, and it is part of international law, and it also it applies in Canadian law. So there's already been letters that the federal government received that were sent in regard to the Trans Mountain, for example, and I believe Mount Poly as well. So there's some examples already right there, and we just have to continue to do that and network and work together. So I hope that answers some of it. I could say more, but I'll wait for maybe another question in the final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that gave us a number of issues that need to be looked at the same time. It's a variety of ways that we need to address this question. I'll ask the same thing of you, Romeo. What issues do you see at stake here, and actions we need to take to implement, and what hope do you have, or do you have hope?
Well, I think if we're serious about reconciliation, we need to address that and what it means. And it's also about political will. But let me first pick up on one thing that Chief Wilson just said, that the work internationally needs to continue. I was pretty disappointed, for instance, during the second NAFTA negotiations, that the AFN would beg to have a provision or a chapter on Indigenous peoples and their rights in that new free trade agreement with the US and Mexico. Why didn't we ask, in keeping with our right to self-determination as peoples, a seat at the table? Because this is what's all about. These free trade negotiations are all about our territories, our lands, and our resources. Why don't we have a seat at the table? This is what self-determination looks like. So I just wanted to mention that first. The Supreme Court, when it talks about reconciliation, and it did before even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created, and then the subsequent report and calls to action in 1984 in the Haida Nation case. The Supreme Court said reconciliation, the objective of reconciliation is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. The assumed sovereignty of the Crown. It means Jesus took over. It's called dispossession. So that's one part that we need to address, and that's a great challenge, as we all know in this country. It's also about political will. I have, I think, enough political experience, over 40 years, as a matter of fact, to know that all of this is about political will. Governments govern by making choices and choosing sides. And never is that choice on the side of Indigenous peoples and their rights in this country, sadly. I remember when we signed the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, the first modern treaty in this country in 1975. It's a fair agreement, negotiated under duress, I must admit, but fair agreement. We had a lot of stuff in there. But it took 25 to 30 years for both governments, Quebec and Canada. By the way, it's the first treaty in this country that a province also signed on to. So it took 25 to 30 years to implement the provisions of the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. Why? Because there was no political will after they got what they wanted, building that James Bay project. I'll give you an example of that. Chapter 28 is about social and community development of the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. Chapter 28 talks about the obligation of both governments, Quebec and Canada, 50-50, to build community centers in every Cree village in Northern Quebec. Pretty simple, black and white, black on white. Pretty simple provision. Well, that took 25 to 30 years to implement. You know why? Because they claimed, both Quebec and Canada claimed, that there was no definition in the James Bay Agreement of a community center, what a community center was. That's bad faith. That's not political will. And I'm pretty sure, even if we had Bill C-262 today, that these kind of things are going to continue to happen. And I'll give you the example of John Horgan, when he was asked, you have Bill 41 now that recognizes traditional forms of government of Indigenous peoples, that requires free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples over lands, territories, and resources. Well, he said that decision was already taken about Trans Mountain and LNG. It was already taken. Bill 41 is about moving forward from here on. Well, that's bullshit for me. That's bullshit because the UN Declaration already had application before Bill 41 in Canada, including BC, before even Bill 41 was considered. That's bad faith. That's not political will. So that's the main challenge that we have. We have all the frameworks, legal frameworks in place. We have the jurisprudence from the Supreme Court. We have treaties. We have the Constitution. We have international law. We have Indigenous law. All of these frameworks are already in place, mutually reinforcing, distinct but mutually reinforcing, as I said. So everything is there. It's just a matter of political will. Although Bill C-262 was not, did not pass Senate, unfortunately, I think there are at least 6 pieces of federal legislation that make reference to the UN Declaration. So at least that's the hope that I have to answer the question. There's some hope because at least that discussion has taken place over the last couple of years with 641 and then 262. That discussion has moved us towards having federal legislation making reference to the UN Declaration, whether in their preambular paragraphs or in the operative paragraphs of these legislations. So I think we're moving slowly, but I think if there was political will to do things right, we would be moving much faster. But I know very well from political experience that these things are pretty challenging and take time, unfortunately. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's not very complicated to have some political will to do things right.
Thank you, Romeo. Romeo, you just have to do it. Jennifer, any thoughts you have on this question of what's going on, what's impeding things, and the hope that something that gives you hope?
Yeah. Political will, absolutely, because I think, lots of times you might hear governments say, oh, well, it's too expensive, or da 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 da. Well, I think we've seen this year that when governments need to, they can mobilize money. So I don't ever want to hear that we can't afford to respect Indigenous peoples' human rights. That's a crazy argument, unacceptable. And the reality is, no, it isn't easy. Implementing human rights is not easy work. That doesn't mean that we're not doing it. And that doesn't mean that we shy away from it or we make excuses for it. And the reality is governments need to work close collaboration and close cooperation with Indigenous peoples and do this work. And, I think there's some good examples that we've seen in the province of BC in some of the agreements and in some of the negotiations that have gone on there. And I think we need to be seeing much, much more of that. It's not going to happen overnight. We're not implementing the entire declaration in a month. We're not going to implement all 94 calls to action in 5 years, right? We haven't. We're nowhere near there. The work needs more priority. Political will, I absolutely agree, is part of the equation. And it needs the commitment. It needs people to not say, oh, something else is more important right now. And I think that good faith dialogue has to be there, and it has to be there. And when people do have that good faith dialogue, and when people really want to get that work done, they can sit down together and they can make that happen. We've all seen that. So that needs to happen more. And there, of course, there's going to be challenges, but also remember, the Declaration is much more than, it has so many important and rich elements, and it has so many important provisions around land and resources, but it also has so much on culture and on language and on spirituality. There's so many elements to the Declaration, and it's so rich, and it applies in so many areas. So that work really needs the focused work of working with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples setting the mandate and setting the tone for that work to happen. And just a note on giving me hope. I thought about this. What gives me hope? So I'm gonna tell you a little story. Short. I'll make it short. Let's see now. Maybe a year and a half ago, my colleague Paul Joff, who's a lawyer with the Grand Council of the Crees, worked for decades with Romeo. Paul and I were doing a presentation on Haida Gwaii, and we'd been invited to come by the Council of the Haida Nation to come and give a workshop on the Declaration, on what it was, what it contains, how it might be useful to Haida people. And so we had the pleasure of visiting Haida Gwaii and doing this work. So we did this presentation. When it was over, so a young woman comes up to me, and her name is Hannah Edenshaw. She says to me, how did you start going to the UN? I want to go to the UN. And so I'm gonna just to tell the story quickly, skip ahead quite a bit, but to make a long story short, we were able to help facilitate having Hannah come on our delegation to the UN last April in 2019. And while she was there, she addressed the United Nations in Haida during the Year of Indigenous Languages, a special event to celebrate the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Hannah was speaking in Haida. And she also addressed the UN on the need for the right of sustainable development to be respected. And right now, currently, she's protecting Haida Gwaii during the ongoing effects of the pandemic. And she's a climate change warrior. And she's a high school student. So Hannah Edenshaw gives me hope. You know, she represents the very best in all of us and our collective future. You know, people like Hannah, I mean, I've done this work a long time, but having the opportunity to spend a couple of weeks at the UN with a high school student that's so amazing, that gives me hope. We're going somewhere.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to all three for the work you're doing. I think you doing this work over the years gives us hope as we try to figure out our place in this journey. So thank you for that. These have been helpful insights as we think about what we're going to do together. We have time for a few more questions from some of the folks that have been watching, and I'll ask Bridget to moderate this next section, see what kind of questions people have been asking.
Thanks, Henry. We have a lot of questions, so we won't have time for all of these questions that have come into the question and answer box there. But we'll take on a couple of them, and then we will talk with our panelists about getting answers to all the questions out to everybody. So, or to the people who have asked them. So just one kind of basic question that was asked is how many or which countries have accepted the UNDRIP? Maybe Romeo can respond to that.
Well, at the time of the vote in 2007, September 2007, 144 accepted the declaration, voted in favor, 11 abstentions, and 4 countries were against at that time. But since then, got on board. So those 4 countries were Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. So all of them have come on board since then. And over the last decade, the United Nations General Assembly has reaffirmed the declaration without a vote, which means that today, not one single country in the world is opposed to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you. Another question that came in was a particular interest in Article 13 on the revitalization of naming place names. And the person asked, how do you see this process unfolding in the provinces? It seems like a very, very complicated process. Chief Judy, that'd be great.
Well, I think that's part of the legal pluralism because before the settlers came, we had place names for everything, and place names are a part of our laws and part of how we describe our special places, and everything had place names of water, the mountains, everything. And it was also in seasonal grounds. So I think Article 13 is something that can be implemented. I know the Ministry of Highways out here, we were doing a lot of place naming, but it can't be superficial. It needs to be through a proper process, like self-determination of our nations, that they go through a process because it's a big part of the decolonization. So it can't be just a superficial type thing. I just wanted to say that. And if you know the article is there, it could be implemented by any of the ministries of the government. But I just wanted to say really quickly what the issue is the feds are imposing the Canadian definition of the UN Declaration using their Section 35 policy framework, 10 principles, inherent right policy, comprehensive lands policy, and how they set up the Indigenous affairs by dissolving it and creating 2 new ministries. So they're just plugging along, doing their two-track process. I think that's really important. People know that, and it's status quo into this new relationship based on the federal unilateral definition and interpretation of Aboriginal and treaty rights. So that's their plans. We have to come up with our own plans. And wouldn't it be great if our own plans included that self-determination with reestablishing our place names and reaffirming it, because it's still there. But I see some nations are taking great strides in doing that. So it is another way of implementing. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question from an Indigenous person I have a lot of respect for, so I'm going to read his question. The Supreme Court of Canada, in the Chilcotin decision, declared the radical underlying title of the Crown, and that Aboriginal title rests on this. This Crown title came into existence when the Crown asserted sovereignty. This is nothing more than other words for the doctrine of discovery, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on Canada, the provinces and churches to repudiate. How long will Canada, provinces and churches trade in stolen Indigenous lands and resources? Will churches be the conscience of the nation and provinces and lead the way? Maybe Jennifer wants to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, I sure hope so. I think that I know that lots of churches have repudiated doctrines of superiority, including discovery. And I know that, and I think it's really important. I think it's really important that people understand that. I think that where does Crown title come from? It comes from the doctrine of discovery. And I think it's really, really important for settlers to understand that and be active in the work of dismantling that. And I think that, that is part of the work of reconciliation. And it is, the Declaration repudiates that. And I think that we see that if we have legislation on the UN Declaration, then we are dismantling that. And that is another reason why that legislation is so important. And I think that Canada cannot, as a nation state, go forward in any kind of good conscience until that work is done.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see, I'm checking the clock to see what time it is. There's another question here.
Chief Judy has a question for you.
Oh, go ahead, Judy, sorry.
I just wanted to clarify that, in BC, I stated that most of BC is not in the treaty process. So in reality, in that Chilcotin case, I really felt they erred by calling Crown radical underlying title. It's actually the other way around. Our Indigenous nations hold the underlying title because we never relinquished it, surrendered, or ceded it to any government, the feds or the province or anyone through any processes. And they can't have something that shows that they conquered us or eradicated us. We're still here in our territories. So I really felt the judges erred in that saying that the Crown holds underlying title. I would never ever say that myself. I would never ever state that. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to do one last question here, which I think is relevant for right now. Do you think the governments are going to use COVID-19 expenditures as an excuse to not undertake the expensive work of redress and implementation? The person says, I agree with Jennifer's comment that when governments need to, they can find the money, as demonstrated by the current pandemic performance. But I'm afraid they're going to spin that as an excuse to shut down this vital justice work. And I'll leave that open to whoever would like to respond.
I think that's a good question because you got to think of with COVID, everybody mobilized on every level, and every government had to pay money. And a lot of our Indigenous nations that didn't have the money, we had to just self-isolate to keep the virus from coming into our communities. And a lot of the communities are still in self-isolation and not allowing tourists in their territories or issues with the border crossing. But the monies the government has are from our territories, and the monies that they're allocating are unilateral, not with any input from us. Even the COVID dollars were not discussed with us prior to allocation. And then at the end, we never got the proper supplies or the adequate resources at the end anyway. But yeah, they would be using any kind of excuse, and COVID is kind of an excuse. I think they would come up with as well, because they're saying they're all in deficit in different areas. But we cannot stop. I want to impress on this webinar, we cannot stop this vital human rights work. We cannot let it stall. And there's so many things we can be doing, and we need to continue working on it at all levels and not buy into any of the government excuses or their redirecting. I even stated that when they were talking about the COVID economic fallout, I said I didn't want the same economy we had, because we were marginalized and we weren't part of those economies in many cases. So why would we support the old economy that didn't even include us? We have to get on with building a whole new Canadian economy that includes our Indigenous rights, and that includes the Indigenous people, that the resources, those are the resources and land that's been taken from the Indigenous people. That's the kind of economy, Indigenous economy, that we have to regenerate, a whole new economy. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one final question that our committee was thinking about, and your
There's still a couple of hands are up. Both Romeo and Jennifer were hoping to respond.
Yeah, well, very, very quickly for my part, I think it's the perfect excuse for any politician who does not have the political will to do anything on certain matters, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It took the Liberal government in the previous Parliament 2.5 years to support Bill C-262. Even, and I can say this to today, now that I'm out of that house, they even asked me at one point to withdraw Bill C-262 under pretext that they had something better coming down the line. I'm happy I just continue to proceed with what I had in Bill C-262 because I didn't trust him. I don't think, so they'll use the pandemic as an excuse. They've used it for clean drinking water in many communities. They'll use this as another excuse, unfortunately.
So we had one last question our committee was wanting to ask, and your dedication towards the implementation of the declaration and continuing this fight is part of this question. So many of the people watching tonight want to support the implementation of the declaration. If you could give them one action step to take to support that work, what would it be? What is most helpful and urgent at this time? So one step, if you can each respond to that.
Sure, I'll go ahead. So I would say the file for federal legislation on the UN Declaration is being held by our Minister of Justice, Minister Lametti, with support from Crown Indigenous Relations, but Minister Lametti is the lead. So I would say one step is you can write to Minister Lametti, or you can call Minister Lametti, or you can email Minister Lametti, or all of those things, and share with him your support for the initiative of a government bill that will use Bill C-262 as the floor, which is what the commitment is, and for that bill to pass through the House as quickly as possible, because we must achieve royal assent before the next federal election. And in fact, to make this easy for you, MCC has an online tool to do this. So in fact, people can access that online tool to make that happen. But I really do think politicians need to hear that this is important, and politicians need to know, decision makers need to know that Canadians, settler Canadians want this. So I would encourage people to contact Minister Lametti and voice your support for this initiative. They've made the commitment. We're very pleased they've made that commitment, and now we want them to make sure that it happens.
Yeah, I think the only difficulty right now is that the parties have agreed that the discussions in the House through virtual parliament or in person will be strictly on COVID-19 response. I'm not sure when that agreement between all parties is going to end, but I agree with with Jennifer, we need to inform them that we insist firmly that this government pass legislation in this parliament. So if this agreement among all parties to discuss only COVID-19 ends this fall, well, that legislation needs to be introduced right away.
Thank you. And Chief Judy, one suggestion?
Well, I think, you know, in BC, we have our work cut out for us too, as, you know, Romeo mentioned, Horgan, not even, I think, within a few weeks on their Coastal GasLink, he said, you know, that the status quo most basically applies. So we still have to hold the highest level of governments to their commitments and implement it fully, and the alignment to laws and legislation. So at the federal level, we have to continue to work, and Romeo sounds like he has the timeline there, but it's still going to be where we have to get all of the educators, all of the organizations and the citizens saying, you know, this is one of the #1 priorities that we need in Canada. A lot of people will be focused on COVID and economic recovery and a lot of the work that needs to happen, but we also need to say because we were marginalized in COVID and our human rights weren't recognized. So I think that would be an opportune time to say, this is the reasons why we need the human rights framework in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering so many questions, and I just appreciate you being with us tonight. I'll turn this back over to Henry. Oh, Henry, one more thing. I was going to say that I know Jennifer mentioned, but I'll just reiterate that MCC Canada has launched a new national advocacy campaign to prioritize a legislative framework for UNDRIP and to implement it this year. So there is a link for people to be able to send a message to their Minister of Justice and to the Member of Parliament to ask them to act on that commitment on the MCC Canada Ottawa website. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing with us. We still have a few minutes left. However, it's close to 11 p.m. for two of you on the panel, and maybe we've heard some good things from you, and maybe we'll end it at this point. Jennifer, Chief Wilson, Romeo, on behalf of Mennonite Church, British Columbia, I want to thank you again for your gracious participation with us. We've learned a lot, we've been inspired, and you've called us to action. We appreciate you taking the time to share with us so generously. I know many of you have been working hard all day, and this is at the end of a long day, so thank you very much. And all of you who've attended the webinar, thank you. Let's keep this going. Let's be together in this. Let's realize the declaration that these three folks have been working on for so many years. There's a recording of the webinar that will be available for everyone who's registered. And the questions that you've asked that haven't been answered, we'll work it away to emailing some answers to you. To close this evening, I'd like to send us off some words from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. There in the report, it was written, in Canada, law must cease to be a tool for the dispossession and dismantling of Aboriginal societies. It must dramatically change if it's going to have any legitimacy within First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Until Canadian law becomes an instrument supporting Aboriginal people's empowerment, many Aboriginal people will continue to regard it as morally and politically malignant force. A commitment to truth and reconciliation demands that Canada's legal system be transformed. Thank you all. Thank you all for the work you're doing, and may we live into this commitment, friends, with much hope, knowing that together with the Creator's blessing, we can make this dream a reality. Peace to you all, and have a good night.
Miigwech.
Kukpi7, thank you.
Thanks very much.